Hello DE and fellow Tenno. I wanted to give a little bit of feedback on the current state of the Relic system. First I'll go over a positive, which was on the reward selection screen. A while back they added the colors to the Relic rewards that you can select from. And this allows players to know, more or less what the item's Ducat value is, and which parts are likely to be more playable for selling, without needing tons of in-game knowledge concerning hundreds of possible drops or a third-party app. So that's awesome. This also has the increased and overall value of like 15 Ducat parts, because the general situation is that what happens is that people tend to select them less, or if they do get them, they tend to turn them in for Ducats. And then that also, of course, brings down the value of the 100 Ducat drops, because people select those always, unless there's a specific reason not to. And what that allows is that we have a situation where the mean average for the value of the parts is closer together, which is overall good for the community and DE as a whole, I think. Arguably, that also builds some goodwill with the players, since they're not really forced as early into the game into buying plat to try to make ends meet, because they can sell the 15 Ducat parts for, on average, I would say 5 to 10 plat at the current time. And, if they individually sell them, or they can sell them for junk prices as well. And that allows them to afford things that they're going to need early on, like Orkin reactors and Forma and things like that. On a side note, though, I do want to talk about the reward screen real quick, which is, this is a pretty common problem I notice, and you'd think it would be easy to figure out, but a lot of newer players just don't know that they can click on other people's rewards in order to select them. And I see it all the time when I'm running relics, when they're MR6 or less, say, and they run into players all the time, so they're like, what do you mean by select the right reward? And you'd think they'd be able to figure it out by seeing other people's names move around, but it just doesn't click for some reason. So I'm proposing that you put a giant select your reward right at the bottom of the screen that can't be missed in giant bold letters, and that will help train new players to understand that they should and could select other items that are available on the reward screen. I would also suggest only doing that if they've achieved 10 traces. That said, I will offer that there is a major problem that is a recurring problem that's been a problem for a long time with the Relic system, and that is the Lith capture missions that are hosted on Earth. Those nodes in particular are selected for the speed at which they can be completed, which is, on average, with a pug party, you're looking at 2.5 to 3 minutes. If you're doing it solo or with a really experienced group, you can get it under 90 seconds. That said, the problem with this is that it's very common that if you're loading into a pug, which stands for pickup group for those that don't know, is that oftentimes it will load a player in right as you're capturing the capture target. And the problem with that is that maybe 2 or 3 of the traces have already been obtained, and they don't appear on your map when you load in. And that causes a situation where they aren't able to obtain enough traces by the end of the mission. And that causes a few problems. One is, first, is that the rest of the team says, screw that guy, he's not going to get his traces, we're extracting. That's not really a good, positive environment. The other one is, let's all hunt around in the mission for 5 minutes to see if there's an enemy we missed that has traces. That is also not good, especially since people are selecting the mission for the speed at which it can be completed. It often then will, of course, cause people to abort, even if they carried 90% of the damage and kills, because it becomes impossible for them to complete it, because they just can't get enough void traces because there's no more spawns. The reason this happens on Lith specifically and on Earth is that the map is exceptionally short, which is good because newer players shouldn't have really long maps, like say in the void, that the capture target is literally seconds away from the start of the mission if you're playing a speed frame, which most people do if they know what they're doing. So that means that if you load in just a couple seconds behind the host, you've already missed 2 or 3 chases, you know. There's a low spawn rate of enemies on these maps, of course, because you don't want to spawn in a ton of enemies for newer players that are just starting out, which makes sense. You know, and there's no good way for you to complete this in-game because there's just not enough traces available. What I would propose is that you consider making sure that post the capture of the target, that a minimum of 10 trace-bearing corrupted units will spawn. This makes it viable always to not screw over 1 to 3 members of your party, to have to abort because you're a burden on the party because you've wasted their time because you can't complete the mission. And also, you aren't spending 5 minutes hunting around, which is almost twice the time as it takes to complete the mission. You know, so it's just a bad situation all around for players. If you do put the 10 traces there, it makes it so that so long as you load into the mission, completion of the relic is still possible. It might take an extra minute, but it's still possible to do. And the main issue I have with this is that it's a long-term problem, and I don't know that DE's been told about it, but I would assume they have more than once. And if they're intentionally setting players up into a mission for a random group, which is how the game is intended to be played, that's basically setting the player up for failure, and not just the player, but the whole team, because the team now misses out on that drop as well, which is a potential reward that they could select from. And I know that, like, you probably aren't wanting to encourage speed frames to run these under 90 seconds, you know, but it's an option, and because it's an option, players are going to do it in order to maximize their reward output for their time investment. That's just how players are. They're always going to do that. They're not going to stop, ever. That's never going to not be a thing. Not all players play that way. Some players play suboptimally on purpose, but the vast majority of players that stick with the game for a long period of time are going to go out of their way to be as efficient as possible. That's just not going to change. So I think it's overall just a bad thing that we have a situation where players are set up to fail, oftentimes on one very specific type of mission, and it happens a lot. That said, I do think that you know, if that issue is corrected, it only is ever really a problem maybe on an exterminate also, but that's usually far less of a problem because the exterminates tend to spawn more enemies, and the maps tend to be a little bit longer, and it does happen, but nowhere near as much. So please do address that ongoing issue. I put forth a potential solution, please consider it. And there are obviously other solutions, I think that probably is the best one. The last thing to cover is a 2-part problem, and part of it involves the relic system and part of it doesn't, but it works together in a certain way. So the first problem is that ribbon slivers need a sync besides ribbons. Just take a look here, you can see that I have over 200 ribbon slivers, and that's trying not to acquire them, meaning that the only time I would have acquired them before the seal path was when we got all ribbon slivers, and I had no other choice. And there was no way for me to get a different kind of reward, because even an amber star is way more valuable than a ribbon sliver that I can literally never use, because I just keep acquiring more than I can spend. And this isn't a unique problem for me. This happens to pretty much anybody that's post-game, because you want to be running Radiant Relics, and in order to run Radiant Relics, you run lots and lots of Requiem Relics, because you don't need to Radiant those, because you already have all of the potential good rewards from them in great quantities, and you get void traces from them. So in order to get your Radiant Relics up, you want to run your Requiem Relics. And even with that farm in place, it's still not a great way to get a good quantity of traces, because as you can see from my inventory, there is literally tons and tons and tons of relics that if I radiant them, I will never be able to finish all of these at the rate that I acquire relics. I'm just going to keep getting more and more, and I'm never, ever, ever going to catch up. Literally ever. And running them without radiance on them, it's just not really worth my time investment. I can make a lot better rewards in other areas of the game that are going to be worth more and be more valuable. So since there's no good way to farm void traces in bulk, and we need a sink for ribbon slivers besides just ribbons, which that's great. I'm really glad you guys added that. I think that's really good for newer players to be able to acquire one ribbon a week if they happen to put the time in, to get the 10 slivers. And that said, with that, for people that are post-game like myself, we have nothing we can do with these. It's an actual bad drop. It's a non-reward. So if we could break these down into void traces, I would say probably 15 is fair, because that's a reasonable amount. It's what you would normally get for running a relic if you got the mean average and you didn't have a Smita proc. So that would make it so that this is now worth a reward. It's worth something to a player that has too many ribbon slivers. If they can be busted down into just 15 or so traces. And that also gives us a permanent eternal sink to dump our ribbon slivers into that we otherwise have no use for, because we can't ever spend them fast enough. So that's my current situation with relics on the relic system. I hope you guys have taken what I said to heart and maybe thought about some other potential solutions to the issues. But again, massive good job on adding the colors to the relics. That's had a massive impact on the market for the better for all players. So thank you for that. Well, not for all players. People that are scammers probably are losing and not being able to scam as much. And I'm okay with that. So, because people now know more what their parts are approximately worth, even if they don't have third-party apps and all sorts of other things, they're able to judge that much easier now. All right, thank you guys, and have a good one.